The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Rosie Blore.
And I'm Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world.
Jair Bolsonaro is banned from holding office in Brazil, but that doesn't stop him using his influence. And the latest round of elections shows that the right is very definitely on the rise.
And the genre of what's now called self-help books has a long backstory. We take a historical ride through them and find that, well, it's not so much about improving oneself as it is about easing one's anxieties. But first,
flight directors go for launch. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
There's something about watching the Starship Super Heavy craft developed by SpaceX launch that's almost like the platonic ideal of a rocket launch.
Vehicles pitching downrange.
Oliver Morton is our planetary affairs editor.
The rocket itself has no taper to it, so it's just this slightly sharp-headed cylinder of shiny steel, 120 meters high. And when it goes up, the flames that come out of it, that propel it upwards, are remarkably straight and collimated, like a column of light, very little smoke. And the power is just extraordinary. I mean, this is about twice as powerful as the Saturn V moon rockets. So seeing this thing go from being effectively a pretty large building into a lance traveling up through the sky, it's quite extraordinary.
So take us through exactly what it was that we saw yesterday.
So after a few minutes, the bottom cylinder, the Super Heavy booster, throttles back, so it's only using, I think, at the end, 3 of its engines.
Our next major milestone coming up, it's going to be hot staging. We're going to see the engines ignite on ship to push it away from the booster.
The top bit, the Starship proper, throttles forward and lights up its 6 engines, and the 2 go their separate ways.
Stage separation. Booster
stage separation, hot stage separation.
With the Starship continuing on into what is more or less, but not in fact, an orbit around the Earth.
Power, I'm seeing 6 out of 6 Raptors lit.
Getting faster and faster as its 6 engines burn for 10 minutes or so on from there.
Is now making its way back to the launch
while
site.
The Super Heavy booster, which is basically a very large elongated tin can, relights some of its engines in order to move itself back towards the starbase, as they call it in Texas, from which it was launched, and then basically falls down 75 kilometers, more or less straight down.
First view of the blue flames from the booster. As you can see there, first stage now making its way back to the launch site. Again, we are...
Ship avionics power assumption.
Holding out its little fins and fluttering them in the wind until it's almost at the surface of the Earth.
We're now down to 3 Raptor engines. We can see those chopsticks now.
Then, happily on this case, 13 of its engines start up again, and in just a few seconds it goes from more or less the speed of sound to more or less the speed of a very fast car. And then its last 3 engines, which guide it in so it starts sliding back next to the launch tower, at which point the huge arms, which the SpaceX people call Mechazilla, because they're the SpaceX people and they would, close around it, and there it is.
First ever attempt, we have successfully caught the
It's come back to where it took off from just 7 minutes ago, and it's hanging there with a little bit of flame still spluttering around at the bottom end. People around the world are exclaiming with various levels of profanity, various levels of sincerity, and various levels of, I believe, actually tears. Wow.
And everything you ran through there was about the return of the booster, which, to be fair, was the really striking bit. But what about the Starship itself?
The Starship itself, possibly feeling slightly miffed about being sort of like now a supporting player at its own event, flies on about halfway around the Earth and then does something which the booster doesn't have to do. It then re-enters the Earth's atmosphere at great speed. I mean, its maximum speed is about 26,000 kilometers an hour. It goes belly first into the atmosphere and develops a heated plasma of air in front of it, and which it's protected from pretty well by its thermal protection system. Then just before it hits the Indian Ocean, it flips itself so that it too is now coming down vertically, turns on 3 of its engines, and lowers itself fairly gently onto the surface of the ocean, where it floats for a bit.
A live view from a buoy that we had out at the landing zone.
Now, in some future test flight, though we don't know which, the idea will be that the Starship goes fully into orbit and then at some point decides to come down, and it too is caught at a launch tower.
And all of this is in aid of making the whole business reusable and therefore making the whole space business cheaper, right?
It's a matter of two things. Yes, reusable means cheaper. The other thing is that this allows you to put really quite big things into low Earth orbit, or to put a lot of things into low Earth orbit at a time. When this first iteration of Starship is operational, it will take something like 150 tons into low Earth orbit. That's an extraordinarily large amount by contemporary standards. SpaceX is already talking about further models, which would effectively be the same thing, but with more powerful engines and just bigger spacecraft that would get up to 200 or 250 tons per launch into orbit. That means you can launch very big things like prefabricated space stations, for example.
So this is mostly then about more payloads into low Earth orbit.
Well, it's also about moving people beyond low Earth orbit, because Starship, once it's in low Earth orbit, it's not quite a Starship as Captain Kirk would understand it, but it is, in principle, a way of going beyond low Earth orbit. You have to fuel it up first, because by the time it gets into orbit, it's not fully fueled, but SpaceX has plans to put up a sort of like fuel depot where propellant will be taken up by tanker versions of Starship, from which versions of Starship which wish to go further can fill up in low Earth orbit and then move on. A Starship variant like that is the vehicle which NASA very much plans to use for its first human moon landings for the last 60 years. Elon Musk, the founder and CEO of SpaceX, wants to use them to push onwards towards Mars. For him, the moon is a sort of like paying gig from NASA, and that's nice, but Mars is where his attention is really focused when it's not focused on helping to elect Donald Trump or spreading misinformation on X, formerly Twitter.
So, okay, lofty ambitions, but what kind of timelines are we talking about, and what needs to be done between now and then?
NASA still claims that it might put people onto the moon in 2026. I think most people that I've talked to on this subject think that that's definitely not going to happen. Mr. Musk talks about sending uncrewed starships to Mars as soon as 2026, which is the next planetary alignment that allows a low-energy transfer orbit to Mars. And I wouldn't necessarily entirely bet against that, but my sense would be possibly more likely the opportunity after that. They come about every 2 years. And certainly Mr. Musk thinks he will be sending people to Mars by the 2030s. He may say the 2020s, but by the 2030s.
But your assessment on the basis of what we saw yesterday, what we've seen before yesterday, is that SpaceX is the kind of company that can, in fact, pull this off.
It's worth remembering that SpaceX has not just built excellent rockets in the Falcon 9 and now is in the process of building this big-ass Starship thing. It's also built already a spacecraft that can take crews. It's a profoundly capable engineering setup, more capable, I think, than any of Mr. Musk's other various interests. And I think that's because the people at SpaceX may not believe in Mr. Musk, but they believe in a lot of what Mr. Musk wants to do when it comes to building amazing spacecraft and sending them places. And that level of alignment between an elite technical staff and a somewhat disturbing owner, but one who provides a very clear lead as to what the company is meant to be doing, that's quite a powerful thing.
Oliver, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure as always, Jason.
The Starship launch is just the latest sprint in a far wider space race. And just like the last one, that brings in plenty of superpower competition. Luckily for you, Oliver has spoken to my colleagues all about exactly that on this week's episode of Babbage, our weekly subscriber-only science and tech show. Launch yourself over there on Wednesday. What's that, you say? You're not signed up? Inconceivable! Listen, cut through the noise and subscribe to Economist Podcasts Plus now. You can get a free trial. Go on.
Brazil's disgraced former president, Jair Bolsonaro, is back in the spotlight. Though he's banned from the highest office, he's using his popularity to help the far-right make a comeback.
O futuro está aí. Vale a pena qualquer sacrifício pela nossa pátria. E a direita que está
During Brazil's recent municipal elections, he hit the campaign trail to drum up support for populist candidates. He also used the occasion to decry the various investigations that he and his supporters face.
essas condenações do 8 de janeiro, nós temos que através de uma lista.
Though Bolsonaro is no longer a candidate, he's still shaping Brazilian politics.
Some analysts consider Brazil's municipal elections a little bit like American midterms in that they're often used as a bellwether for voter sentiment.
Anna Lankas is our Brazil correspondent.
And this year's poll can tell us a little bit about what we might expect at Brazil's next presidential contest in 2026. And the main takeaway is that a conservative candidate is probably poised to do very well.
Okay, so Anna, talk me through the results. Who won?
Center-right parties were the big winners of the night. And there's two reasons for that. The economy is doing well, and much more importantly, pork barrel politics. So over the past few years, lawmakers have been able to wrangle bigger and bigger earmarks for their municipalities from the federal budget. They've been spending big before the election, which gave incumbents the advantage. So mayors had a re-election rate of around 81% nationally, which is much higher than the historical average of 58%. Most of these incumbents were from centrist or center-right parties. But another winner of the night was President Jair Bolsonaro and his supporters.
Okay, so explain that to me. How can someone who's not standing win?
So it's helpful here just to have a quick recap of history. Bolsonaro lost the last election in October 2022 to the current president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who's from the left. And last year, Bolsonaro was barred from holding public office for 8 years because he spread lies in the run-up to the election about voting machines being rigged. Since then, he's had a series of criminal investigations open into him, including accusations that he faked his COVID vaccine and that he stoked riots on January 8th, in which his supporters, who believed that he'd won the presidential election, attacked the Supreme Court, the presidential palace, and Congress. So many people hoped that he'd kind of disappear after losing because it looks increasingly likely that he'll end up in jail. But rather than fade out, he's actually been pretty important on the campaign trail in the municipal elections. He's endorsed some candidates and ignored others.
And what has that meant in practice? Where have we particularly seen Bolsonaro's influence?
I think one place we really see this is in Sao Paulo. There you have two right-wing candidates that were important. One of them is the incumbent. He's an establishment center-right figure called Ricardo Nunes, who's very uncharismatic. And the other is called Pablo Marçal, who out of nowhere became really important in this election. And he's a far-right digital influencer. Both were vying for the support of Bolsonaristas. Nunes in order to get Bolsonaro's endorsement, picked as his running mate a former colonel who publishes photos of his own kids carrying semi-automatic rifles. And Marçal, in order to get Bolsonaro voters to support him, Bolsonaro. He's been doing loads of crazy things on the campaign trail and spreading lots of false information about other candidates, including accusing them of taking cocaine and being rapists. He showed up to the vote 5 minutes before polls closed, barefoot to cheering supporters. Before that, he'd goaded another rival into hitting him with a chair during a live mayoral debate broadcast in September. He didn't advance to the runoff, but he did way better than expected. He got 28% of the vote. And what this shows is that to be successful as a conservative in Brazil today, in many ways, you either have to be more Bolsonarista than Bolsonaro himself, or you have to do everything it takes to get his voters, to get his endorsement.
So you've described a circus in Sao Paulo. What's happening elsewhere? How is Bolsonaro tipping the scales in other races?
So in 23 of Brazil's 100 or so largest cities, candidates with backing from Bolsonaro were polling in first place prior to election day. And they did better in the municipal elections than Lula's candidates did. That means that leading right-wing candidates who are thinking about running in the 2026 elections, they're sensing the mood and they're changing tack too. Voters often care about very local things in the municipal elections. They choose candidates for slightly different reasons in the presidential race. However, we have some indications of who might run in the 2026 presidential race. And of the conservatives who might run, they're increasingly tacking to the right. So one of them is called Tarcísio de Freitas. He's the governor of Sao Paulo state. And he was long considered a moderate. He was Bolsonaro's infrastructure minister, but he also has worked in previous left-wing governments, and he's very cozy with bankers on Faria Lima, which is Brazil's Wall Street. But in order to get more support from Bolsonaristas in recent months, he's been toughening up his image, and he's been authorizing increasingly violent military operations in Sao Paulo's poorest neighborhoods.
So, Anna, what you're describing is a picture of much greater polarization in Brazil. What's actually going on the left?
I think the left is stagnating. So Lula's Workers' Party did worse than both center-right parties and Bolsonaro's Liberal Party. And even candidates that had Lula's backing didn't really want to associate themselves with him strongly. So in Rio, the incumbent won. He's an ally of Lula, but he's not in Lula's party, and he distanced himself from Lula. He also found conservative allies to court conservative voters. Nationally, Lula himself remains relatively popular, and he's hinted that he'll run for the presidency again in 2026. But he's going to have a Biden problem, because by then he'll be nearly 81 years old, and he hasn't nominated an heir apparent. And that's a problem, because many of the leading lights in the Workers' Party are very old, and the base of the Workers' Party is shrinking. It used to consist of Roman Catholics, manufacturing workers, and the intellectual urban bourgeoisie. But demographic groups associated with the right wing are taking over the Workers' Party's base. So evangelical Christians are growing and Roman Catholics are shrinking. The agribusiness sector has exploded and industry is in decline. And voters are now much more worried about corruption and crime. What that suggests is that conservative politicians have not just won this election, but are poised to do well, both in the presidential election and in elections for decades to come.
Anna, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thanks for having me, Rosie.
The year 1859 was a big one for British publishing.
Catherine Nixie is a Britain correspondent for The Economist.
Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published, as was John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And so too was a now largely forgotten book by an author named Samuel Smiles. This book was boring, badly written, and critically panned. One writer later called books of this sort the silliest ever known. Naturally, readers loved it. It outsold Darwin, popularised a new term, and in the process, changed publishing forever. It was called Selfhelp, and its aim was simple: to teach readers that, with will, one can do anything. Last year in Britain, 3% of all books sold were self-help ones. That they exist isn't a surprise. For as long as there have been selves, they have needed help, and books have offered it. Marcus Aurelius' Meditations still pops up 2,000 years after it was written on self-help tables in bookshops. And you can see why. Advice such as the soul becomes dyed with the colour of its thoughts could sit happily in any modern manual. By the 17th century, specific books had started to appear offering advice on such important topics as beards of a frightful length and blowing the nose in public. Some of self-help's typical motifs were visible well before the term itself took root. James Clear's Atomic Habits, a multi-million selling self-help book that's popular today, explains how the 4 laws of behaviour change can help with daily habits to stay motivated in life and work and to avoid negative thoughts. Similarly, an 18th century Puritan manual encouraged readers in the habit of dwelling daily on their imminent deaths. Imagine, this manual wrote, thy breath failing, thy throat rattling, thy hands with a cold sweat upon them. A thought which doubtless helped with staying motivated, if not that much with negative thoughts. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that self-help proper started to flourish. The world was becoming more individualistic, and that meant that you wanted to improve your individual self, and also that you had to find time to do so. The first self-help book, Samuel Smiles' book, is typical. This book offers the part liberating, part crushing message that with toil, any man can do what any other man has done. To prove this, it then goes on to offer 400-odd pages of the kind of dislikably disciplined people who sleep for 4 hours a night, work for 16 hours a day, opt for improving toil over the perverted life, and thus succeed enviably. So the reader learns how Galileo, after 50 years of work, invented his pendulum, how James Watt came up with his steam engine after a mere 10, and how Robert Peel, after falling in love with his landlord's 7-year-old daughter, said that he would marry her, waited for a decade to do so, and then did. Grooming a minor, apparently, did not count in those days as the perverted life. As the genre has grown, so too have its claims. And one of the reasons that self-help is so sneered at today is that there is a lot of bad stuff out there, ranging from ill-thought-through ideas to rank charlatanism. Some titles, such as Stay Alive All Your Life, offer advice on things that are rarely considered a problem. Others, such as Think and Grow Rich and I Had Appendicitis and Cured It Myself, invite more than a little suspicion. Whether or not all of self-help's claims are true, these books do reveal a truth, namely what people of different eras are worrying about. The genre is anxiety, alphabetized and quantified. If you look under a list of American self-help volumes, then you will see, under the letter A, 77 titles on adolescence, 17 on aging, and 13 on alcoholism. L, meanwhile, offers you books on loneliness, 6 of them, love, 63 of them, and, unexpectedly and hopefully unrelatedly, livestock. At times, the list reads like a comedy. At other times, it feels more like a tragedy. Under the letter A, after The Ability to Love and Adventures in Nakedness, comes the much glummer Advice to the Lonely, Frustrated and Confused. Each of them says something about the society in which they were written. After the Great Depression in America, books on money-making flourished, though whether they help their readers to flourish is less clear. But then, if you believe Marcus Aurelius, this hardly matters. Wealth, ambition and achievement are, he wrote, all worthless. We are here for but the briefest moment before entering the abyss of eternity. Given that, there may be better ways to spend that brief moment than reading self-help books.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. We'll see you back here tomorrow.